Hi, welcome back. My name's Breslin O'Malley, and I'm here with my co-manager host, Rusty Tanton, and we're talking today with Mathew Zannoni, a longtime co-worker of mine. We haven't spoken in a long time, so really looking forward to this. And as always, Mathew, thanks so much. And this is your one-on-one. What would you like to talk about?
Well, things that have been important to me lately have been job market. So that's something to probably touch on. Then mentorship and code quality are, two other really big points for me, I think. Recently, before I joined the Iroquois group, where I'm a software developer now, I was in the job market for quite a long time. I was doing 1099 work. So I wasn't an official W-2 employee, but, I wasn't, out of work. And one of the interesting things that I ran across a couple times was that people would be like, well, you're not working. I'm like, but I am. I'm just not an official employee. I'm a consultant and I do consultant work. And that was kind of looked down upon by some recruiters, and it kind of blew my mind because you can do anything you want. It's not hard to code. And it was kind of people were jaded, during that process because I was that 1099. And one of the things I got a lot was, well, do you plan to be overemployed while you work for us or while you work for a client?
Oh, wow.
So they thought you were going to moonlight.
Exactly. And I didn't even know, I love Reddit. And so I was on, there's this Reddit, it's called Overemployed. And I never knew about it. It's this thing, people have 2-3 jobs, and it's
wow.
this endemic that a lot of employers are worried about now. So that was something that was kind of, stressful for me because obviously I need the income while I'm looking for work. So I had to kind of hide the fact that I was doing 1099 work while I was looking for work. And talk about a full-time job, right?
Just applying and interviewing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you guys found one of the things that I ran into a bunch of times, drove me nuts? Will you put together an example of your skills with Java? Or will you put together an example of your skills with C#? And in multiple scenarios, I spent, weekends or, 3-4 days putting together an application. So a college, I won't name them, but I interviewed with a college. And they're like, we want you to showcase your Java skills. I said, okay. So using Kafka, and I built a chat app. All right, so Kafka is like an event bus and leisure talk and send event services. And I built a chat application in Java. And you literally, I posted on a website, even put it up live on one of my domains. And I was able to have a conversation with the recruiter over my chat app. They ghosted me for 3 weeks. I didn't hear back. And I checked in and I kept checking in. Hey guys, have you reviewed my code? What do you think? It was on GitHub. So you can go to my GitHub, you can see it. One of the things that's nice about doing code examples for people, if you just send them the code, it's, they can run it and they can experience. But if you put it up on a service like GitHub, you actually can see there's insights that'll show you when people access the code, when they call it. And 2 people out of a team of 5 downloaded that code and ran it and looked at it. And I was like, well, obviously half of your developers just didn't even care to put in the effort. And then following up just became real frustrating because eventually it was like, yeah, sorry, we decided not to go with you. And I'm like, man, I spent days working on that.
That is a huge time sink.
Yeah. I've heard, I don't know, there's not always a great solution to this. I remember one I interviewed with, I spent days putting together a 40-page slide deck. Now, I was applying for an engineering manager job, not a dev job, but I had to do a case study. I had to do a 40-page presentation, and I had to go present it to everybody. And then at the end of it, they were like, nah, we're good. And so it's really hard and frustrating. And I've been through similar experiences. Yeah.
It got to the point where at the end of my job search, I was like, are you going to compensate me for my time?
Yeah.
And a few of these hiring managers were like, who are you? Why would you think that? And I'm going to spend literally days. And in some cases, I'm giving you a working code base that you could turn around, give to another engineer, and they could incorporate it into your product if they, really wanted to.
Right.
So for me, I just kind of was like, I got to do something to fight back. I got to do something to demand people respect my time. One of the other things I started doing, and a lot of companies will do this, when you have those code exams, right? Like I've had numerous code exams where you go on to like some kind of leak code website and they, give you a test. And I wish I could remember the name off the top of my head, but it was like tech something. It was a series of C#, exam questions. And you go through the process and they give you this really nifty report at the end. Well, I asked the recruiter, I said, hey, like I want a copy of that report. Like I want to make sure I have that to keep. Can I use it? He was like, yeah, go for it. He's like, it's yours. And out of like 15 different, times I went through that process of doing one of these questionnaires and putting in code examples and basically rating myself on a scale of, 0 to 100 in all sorts of different proficiency categories. 1 out of 15 times I actually got the results and could use them elsewhere.
Yeah.
And
wow.
Yeah.
That's frustrating.
It's brutal out there.
I feel like people don't respect your time as a job seeker a lot of the times,
Yeah. I mean, I know. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, first of all, Rusty has the most experience around this currently. But that plays into what happens when you have a job and you're just, not challenged or you're not happy where you are. I think that you should be allowed to protect your time, because how are you supposed to go do this full-time interviewing type job while also having a full-time job? That's not possible.
Well, I think like 10 years ago, right, I would have, sometimes taken an interview on the phone in the car.
Yeah.
But now, especially with the remote work, everybody wants FaceTime. Everybody wants, code samples. Everybody wants to see your GitHub. And I mean, you don't, like we said earlier, it's almost a full-time job to find employment. Mm-hmm. And if you're spending all that time seeking employment, you're probably not doing great at your job that you're actually working.
Well, yeah, I can just tell you my process, because I just recently got a job about 2 months ago after being laid off earlier in the year. And I applied to, and this is for management. The contributor jobs are even worse, apparently. I applied to close to 200 jobs, and this is not like spray and pray. This is like I wrote a cover letter for each one of those. I in many cases I did take home assignments, or I did code samples, or I did live coding exercises. I mean, the amount of time that I spent interviewing, I would not have been able to do if I had a job. And so I think it's a great point that you bring up, because people are going to get locked into jobs they don't like because the process just has too much overhead for them to even be able to do it while they have a job. And I know another colleague that I spoke with who he was laid off a little bit after me. And one of the things that he brought up was that it was actually harder for him to look for a job while he had a job, because one of the things I found out during my job hunt was that the biggest ROI of single thing I did was to post on LinkedIn to say, hey, I'm looking for a job. Hey, network, help me out. Well, you can't do that when you have a job. So you can't do that. You don't have time to interview. You don't have time to do code samples. I really don't know how people are doing it right now if they're looking for a job while they have a job.
I second the LinkedIn piece, and I agree completely that it's hard because LinkedIn isn't stealthy. Like you cannot be in stealth job search mode on LinkedIn.
They say it is, but someone outside of the network who has a network into your job will tell on you. It happens.
It's too easy. It's too easy. And I will say a recruiter, a friend of mine, a gentleman I've worked with, he's placed me at least 3-4 times in 15 years. This guy's been a great resource for me to find work. I chatted with him on LinkedIn for a little bit. We had a couple phone calls, and out of the blue, he's like, "Hey, I know you're looking. What do you think about this opportunity?" And that was Iroquois Group, which is where I'm at now. And it was without that interaction, I never would have found him.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's huge to stay vocal on LinkedIn, to stay engaged with your network. I think that's really important for sure.
It is.
But
It's kind of crazy, especially going back to the fact that you were a contract worker, right? You're finding jobs because you don't have one right now. And when I was a junior dev, and I did not have any experience yet, I'm straight out of college, I had to do that to keep my skills sharp, to make sure I was making money. And it took me 10 months after college to find a job. And it was looked down upon if you were not contracting at that time. This is like 10 years ago, right? Where it was like, what do you mean you haven't been continuously programming all the time for others? Like it was,
Right.
that's what they wanted. So it's a
we
very
wanna
weird
see you-
shift.
They want to see you doing like, what do you do after work? Oh, I write code for 8
I
hours.
code.
GitHub,
This
right?
is
Like,
my only
yeah.
passion.
Yeah, I've got a life too, but like I was kind of blessed in a way in that I had something to do. Like I left my previous job. I was at a marketing agency. I didn't agree with a lot of the things they were doing, and they were kind of, we know when an employer is not exactly honest or, clear and transparent with what they're doing, they're red flags. I recognized some, and I got out of Dodge while I could. And because I made that decision, and Rusty, I want to ask you your
Sure.
opinion, right? I consciously left a bad situation, sought some contract work to keep me afloat because I saw the writing on the wall that people were going to get laid off. I saw that things were down the pipe that I didn't agree with. And I feel like because I did that, I actually had a leg up on some other people who have been laid off. And was it Indeed, right? Were they the ones who were like, yeah, we laid off the 10% of the worst performers in the company, and they're all
that was Intuit.
Intuit,
Yeah.
yes, Intuit. That's who it was. But horrible, right? Like they literally gave everybody a scarlet letter that they laid off. And do you think that because you were laid off, it was harder for you? Like you said, you did about 200 applications, maybe more.
Well, it's interesting because it wasn't my first rodeo, for one thing. Like I had been through a layoff in 2020 as well. And in some ways, I actually think it's almost easier right now to look for a job when you don't have a job, because the stigma around being laid off, because companies are just shedding people left and right like it's nothing. And one thing that has done that's actually a weirdly positive thing for job seekers is that there's not really a lot of stigma around, in my experience, my anecdotal experience at least, of around being laid off anymore. Or at least there's way less of it. I don't really experience, and some of this may be that I'm a quote unquote industry veteran. I've been around a while. I have almost 20 years of experience. So, that probably helps me get my foot in the door in some places that other people might have trouble with. And, I think it's actually easier when I don't have when I didn't have a job to look for a job now, at least.
Yeah.
And that might not have been the case 10 years ago.
It's almost scary hearing you say that.
Yeah.
That because of how frequent and often layoffs are, it's easier to find a job. I agree with the points that you have brought up about, it's time consuming. You've got more time on your hands, right? Like that's definitely a pretty good point. And I find too, because I've been doing this for 26 years now, I've been programming software, and I find that having the ability to, talk about war stories with other, managers and other, basically who your boss is going to be in the new role, right? Like being able to have those kind of conversations about, hey, back in 1998, I was using Front Page extensions. I got my hands on, a beta copy of C# in 2000 and 2001. I was coding C# before it was even actually released. And like you can have those conversations with people if you've been around for a long time. And like I grew up with .NET, right? Like my career started before it was even really a concept. And from there, I can leverage that into a lot of conversations, which, actually segues nicely into something else I wanted to talk about, mentorship. Like being that we've been around so long, I find it's very easy to, show the younger generation different things about our career. And, a couple pieces of advice I always give to younger devs. And the first piece of advice I always try to give someone who reports to me, it's not your code. It's not Rusty's code. It's not President's code. It's not my code. It is just the code. It's an inanimate thing. It's just an object. And if you remove all of your emotions from that code and your emotional, your pride from that process, you're going to go way farther. You're going to be so much more successful because you don't have an emotional tie to something. Your ego can get in the way if you think you're writing the best code. Like, my code's the best code. I mean, that's not usually the case, unfortunately.
I think some of the worst code I ever wrote was not when I was a beginner, but was probably, 4 or 5 years into my career when I thought I was, well, we can cuss on this podcast, when I thought I was hot shit, right? And, everything was over-engineered. There was too much of it, solutions looking for problems, like basically every terrible thing you can do as a developer. So I think you bring up a good point.
You do. Also, I just have to say, I love that, because I do find that there's a lot of pride in programming. There just is, because when I was in school, I helped grade others' code, and there was like a distinct, it's almost like handwriting. And there was a distinct style that every student ended up having. So everyone, it's coming from them, right? That is almost a piece of your identity. And when we hold even just our jobs in general as that is who we are, I think that it really, really hurts us, especially when things like this are happening, where you're laid off, or the industry is weirdly changing, and maybe you're not as relevant anymore. It can really damage you because you are holding it onto this so tightly. So the thing I tell my devs is that we're not saving babies, because it's like, why is this so important? There are not lives, unless you are literally, I don't know, building software to save babies, which I have not worked at a place that does that. I do not see the purpose in being so tied to this. And one of the things, I'm going on a tangent because this is all very near and dear to my heart, but I have been a dev for 10 years, Matthew, and not a single piece of the code I have ever written is currently in a production anywhere, except for what I did in college. Because that is the nature of the beast.
It's ephemeral.
Companies,
yeah.
Yes, and like, companies are just constantly changing. And until you understand that, it's like a really hard concept. And a lot of those that I mentor struggle when the entire product that they've worked a whole year on does not get released because the company no longer wants it. I don't even have a question in that. I'm just giving a statement. But I really appreciate you bringing that up.
But it's true too, because that emotional, that ego that gets in there, makes you defensive if someone gives you a little bit of critique. And for me, I'd rather be all ears and listening, because how do we get better as developers? Through review, through peer review, through critique that other people give us. We worked with a guy, I'm just going to call him by his nickname. You'll know who I'm talking about, the Russian robot. And the guy was a genius. He was an absolute genius when it came to writing code. But to talk to him about it was very hard, because he was, he had a strong investment in the approach that he took to writing code. So critiquing his code, sometimes you get into a situation where you felt, as a supervisor, as someone who was mentoring, that you were being talked down to or looked down upon, because you were offering, it might not be the best way to do it, it might not be the worst way to do it, but you're offering a different path, and there's resistance to take that path, and I feel like being able to remove people's egos makes everything operate so much smoother.
So how do you remove their egos, and how did you deal with the Russian robot in those scenarios?
Well, you have to get very factual. You have to get to the point where it becomes metric driven in some regards, because how do you get by, or rather, how do you measure performance of code, right? There are, how much memory does it use? How long does this process take to run? How efficiently can you, split a process across, 8 threads on a CPU? Those kind of things. And those are all things that you can measure very concretely. And then you can turn around and say, hey, here's some evaluation, and your way takes 5 seconds. This way takes 3.5 seconds. Your way took 2 weeks to write. This way took 1 week to write. And by putting it into more simple terms, more, again, metric, very kind of numbers-based feedback, that helps remove the ego from a lot of the coders.
That's great advice. That's really cool. How long have you been in a leadership position?
So, 15 years I did that. I'm just a member of the band where I'm at now. I am not a rock star. I am not the lead singer. I am just a member of the band for once. And I'll tell you, being just back to an individual contributor role was one of the most relieving things ever. And a part of it, we used to joke, and another friend from a previous life that we shared, he used to say it was the tax. It was the employer's tax on us, was to, be in those supervisory positions and doing that middle management kind of work, and I get to write code all day, every day. And as much as I enjoy the leadership part of it, I do find that I think you need to have a healthy balance of both. If you truly want to be able to excel as a leader, you have to also be someone who can write the code and be in the code on a daily basis. If you only find yourself doing the kind of management aspects of it, you get a little rusty. And we have
what you did there, I see it.
I want to say one, Rusty, lol, and then also two, Rusty and I have discussed this a lot
at length. Yeah, it actually came up. I don't know if you heard it, but in our first episode with Billy, he's an engineering manager, but his previous roles were not code heavy roles. Like, they were very people focused roles. And so he was just ecstatic to be back in an EM role where he was expected to code some of the time. And I've heard other folks, especially in our loyal alumni group, who are former engineering managers who have gone back to coding, and they're like, this is such a relief. I feel this sense of liberation doing this. And I don't know. I mean, what is it that's draining about that middle management work, where people kind of hit that point where they feel like they're done for a while? Maybe not forever, but for a while they need a break from it.
There's a certain aspect of the politics of it. Mm-hmm. Right? Like I've worked in roles where one of my best coders, guy I'm still friends with to this day, the CEO of the company came to me and said, look, you need to give me a reason to fire this guy at his next review. He's literally the best coder we have. Why? Well, I don't like his attitude. I don't like him as a person. Well, I mean, that sounds like a you problem, sir. That's not his problem. Like, he is one of the best employees you have. And if you're going to get rid of him, then I'm going to go with it. Like, I'm not going to do that. And I, like, the political tensions of it definitely come into play. I've worked where I wanted to promote people from, like a senior dev or up into like a principal. And the attitude was, well, they don't want to, manage people. So we don't want to make them a senior or a principal. It's like, but why? Like, they're engineers. They've been lifelong engineers, and they want to continue writing excellent code and delivering, solid products to their customers. Why would you hold them back from that simply because they don't want to manage other people? And in some cases, they weren't the most personable, people. They were great coders. They were great engineers, but their people skills weren't on par of someone who needs, of what you need to be able to manage people.
Yeah.
And if someone is an excellent coder and excels at writing code, I don't believe you should be holding them back, you know? And it gets tiring after a certain point, because it's like you advocate for the people on your team, you advocate for the people that work for you and that do good work and really do deserve a raise and recognition and promotion. And, you know, the company is just like, yeah, we're not going to give them the time of day. We don't believe the same as you. But the people making those decisions aren't there working in the trenches on projects with these engineers. So, like, how are you making that decision? What do you, if I'm the person who's like kind of the buffer to determine whether or not these individuals, you know, deserve a promotion or get a raise, and you're not taking my advice or listening to the guidance I'm trying to share with you, why am I doing this role?
Yeah.
And that was the most exhausting part of it in some of my previous positions where I was a leader, that like, man, like I'm trying to do right by my guys and you're not letting me do that.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a certain amount of healthy disagreement that can happen between your uppers, your upper management and your middle management. But what you're describing sounds like more than that. It sounds like they were trying to push one developer out. They were just not being supportive at all.
I mean, maybe not the best. I haven't worked for some of the best companies in the past. I've worked for some great companies, don't get me wrong. At this point, I mean, like I said, I've been doing this 26 years, so I've got a lot of different experience at, you know, companies. And one thing I also try to stress to younger devs, to people who are, you know, trying to get up that corporate ladder, the grass is not always greener on the other side of the fence. And you might look over there and they might have a really nice green yard, but you know what? When you get over there, you're going to find out it's just AstroTurf. It's not grass at all. So you got to be careful, you know, and really think through the reasons of why you want to, you know, leave one job and potentially start another.
Yeah.
So like for me, like I definitely got to be careful, and, you know, there are things to look for. And I mean, there are all these sites out there, Glassdoor, you know, being one that comes to mind real quick. People put reviews online because they're typically angry or upset, and that's only one avenue. But LinkedIn, back to that, right? Like if you're looking for a new job, you want to go start a job somewhere else, talk to the people who work at the company, like befriend them on LinkedIn. And I'm not so active on LinkedIn now, but while I was actively seeking a job, I was reaching out to all the people on LinkedIn. I was making posts. I was sharing, you know, my friends' posts who were looking for work. I was commenting on, you know, people who are trying to be influencers on LinkedIn within the programming space, within the coding space. And for me, like, I made a lot of good friends and a lot of good connections that way. But the other thing too is like, hey, what do you think about the company you work for? Are they a good company to work for? If you had a choice, would you continue working there for 5 to 10 years? And making those connections and having those conversations is really helpful.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think that's such good advice. To flip the script on these companies, we need to be interviewing them.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know I can do the job. I've gone to school. I have experience. I know exactly what I'm good at. I know how to get help where I don't have it. Like, and there's so many people who have that ability. Why should I work for you? Why should I put my like blood, sweat, and tears and identity into your company?
Yeah.
Not enough of that is happening.
What sold me about, and I've never felt like I'm going to retire at a company before. What sold me on the company I work for now is the fact they sent me flowers. Day one, I started day one, and they sent me flowers.
That's cool.
I will retire with this company, like hands down. Like, I'm going to be there for a long, long time. And one of the things that stood out during the interview process too was they actually cared about getting me the right answers to questions that I brought to the table, questions that I asked. And one of the other things I try to tell, you know, younger developers, people looking to get into this career, is when you go into an interview, make sure you've done some research and have actual questions. But don't ask questions that are just, baseline, simple questions. Do some digging. Find out the why behind, the reasons a company operates. If they're in a certain industry, what brought them into that industry? How did they get started? What were the values that the founders of the company, cared about and upheld? And if you start doing still, you don't have to dig deep, but do a little bit of research, understand what you're getting into, and then bring those tables to bring those questions to the table and ask them during your interview. And if you do that, you can avoid a lot of pitfalls. You can avoid ending up in a job where you're not happy. You can avoid, ending up at a company that probably, may or may not respect you.
God, that's amazing. I love it, Matthew.
I know the third topic you have here, you wanted to transition into talking about what we can do as a small dev team.
Quality. Well, quality is important, right? Like if you don't produce quality code, why do you write code at all? Think about this. And just a couple quick examples. Equifax data breach years ago. Everybody who made that happen still works there. CrowdStrike, right? More recently. Literally, that bug never should have made it to production. So, like, quality is important, right? Like, quality is very important when you're producing anything that drives business, but more importantly than that, anything that touches the lives of, millions of people. Right? Like, we build software as tools, and I built e-commerce sites. I've built, applications for the legal system. I've built applications for hospitals and insurance companies. And anytime you're building something that touches that many people, and with insurance, like health insurance is huge. Like you don't want to make mistakes. You really want to have an eye on quality. And when you're a small team, as I've been many, many times, you've got to kind of look for little efficiencies that you can gain here and there. Automate everything that you can is the first thing I'll say as far as quality goes. Anytime you have a manual process and you've got to go through 15 steps, let's say, to package your code and deploy your code, deploy the database, etc. Anytime you're doing that, any one of those 15 steps can fail. So automation is a huge threat to any developer, right? So that's one thing which I think is really important. But then in addition to that is getting other people's opinions. This kind of goes back to one of the things I opened with about, removing the ego from the code. Code review should be in every developer's toolkit. Like a code review should be something that happens for everything you do. Even if it's just a quick, I'm changing a couple things in this template and I want to get it deployed. And there's a couple reasons for why I say code review is so important. One, sometimes there's a typo and you don't miss the fact that you've transposed, a letter with another letter. And, now you've got a simple misspelling. Well, that misspelling might actually make it to production. I want to admit something. No, I'm not without my faults. I've broken the build, right, because I didn't actually hit build in my IDE and checked in what I thought was literally a one-word change because I transposed an N and a Y.
Yeah.
And I didn't pick up on it. And there was no code review process in place. There was no gated check-in. There was nothing. That got checked in. It hit a pipeline. It got deployed to prod. And a multi-million-dollar e-commerce site ground to a halt because of a simple transposition of two letters. That's an embarrassing moment, right? That is an incredibly embarrassing thing to have happen. But there's a couple things I'll say about that. If you're using a tool like Azure DevOps, you can set up a gated check-in. And the first thing that means is if the code doesn't build, you can't check it in. Like that should be one of the first gates that you have. I like to go a bit further. You should have a work item associated, right? Because if you've got a work item, then there's a little bit of description attached to that work item as to what was done. You should always have a commit message that says, hey, I changed X in Y, and here's the reasoning. Because then if something does break, you've got more visibility into what was changed, where, and why. But beyond that, that's kind of a form of automation. Beyond that, you really do need that human element at some point. So one of the things I've always advocated for is pull requests. And a pull request is, you basically spin off a feature branch off of your dev branch, and your feature branch contains all the code that you need to accomplish some feature and meet some acceptance criteria, right? So you check that in, and now you merge it, you make a pull request into dev. And what that accomplishes is it says, hey, you're my partner dev. Come over here, take a look at this, Rusty. Tell me what you think. President, give me your opinion, look at this code. And I've worked with some people, I've worked with some really, really solid engineers over the years who will come in and take a look and be like, hey, I found these 3 things that I think might be a concern. Let's talk about it. And having that conversation, it's not just, hey, I think this is a bad idea, or hey, this is wrong. It's, hey, here's 3 things. And you have to be, what I'd say, productive in a code review. You can't just say, I don't like it, it's not going to work. You have to say, I don't like X because it's going to cause Y. Or what about using this lambda expression instead of this for loop? Or, you've got this massive switch statement with 100 parameters. Maybe we could do something a little bit differently. Having actual conversations around the code being checked in does a few things, right? It gives other people insight into your process. It allows your, coworkers to actually question the reasoning behind what you're doing. And I think that's huge because everybody's got, a different approach. And different approaches, if you tell me your approach and I explain my approach, I'm going to learn something, right? And that's, I think, a big part of the development process that a lot of people miss is that every day you should be learning something as a developer. And I would argue that if you're not learning something every day, are you doing your job right? Because it's about asking questions, right? It's about having conversations about code and better ways to do things. And if we hadn't been asking questions all along, we wouldn't have, gotten agile. We wouldn't have, come up with inversion of control. We wouldn't have come up with all these different concepts that we now have. And I just named 2 out of, thousands, right? But without these conversations, you never would have gotten better. And that's a big part of the process of a code review, is just to kind of get everybody on the same page and drive towards better quality code.
I love that. I think you touched on this for just a second, but it encouraging others to perform PRs, because if you're not peer reviewing, even let's say you have almost 30 years, Matthew, and you're my tech lead and you put up a PR and I'm super nervous to be like, well, he's so smart though. He knows what he's doing. In order to create that environment for me to come to you and say, hey, I kind of don't know exactly how to push against this code, but this feels like a spot that might work better. Like how do you create that environment? Because I've heard this from senior devs where they don't get any pushback anymore. So I'm curious if you've ever dealt with that.
Well, so that's part of the thing is so how do you learn something new, right? One of the things that I've always kind of seen as a challenge is that people will come to you and they'll have a new way of doing something and you just shoo it off. No, I don't have time to learn this newfangled feature. And you have things like React, right? React is a good example. I've used React for years. Recently, I started using Next.js. It's a different flavor of React at the end of the day, but it gives me a whole new toolkit and allows me to do certain things quicker and more efficiently. And if another dev that I work with hadn't said, hey, here's what I'm doing with Next.js, I like these 3 things about this tool. What do you think? I would never have given it a shot because we get stuck in our ways, right? Like we're going to always do what we know to be efficient and what we know to work because we've been doing it for so long. So we get into habit, we get into routine, and you need someone else's, fresh take on things. And, if you're a junior developer or a new developer, even, a senior dev, and you're working with someone who is of that mindset that they don't want to learn something new, like push them on that, challenge them on that, like make sure that they know why you're using certain tools. And again, a lot of times it goes back to metrics. I can do things with Next.js a lot more efficiently and a lot faster than you can just using, straight React. Why wouldn't you take advantage of that?
Yeah.
Because it makes you more efficient. You have over time, you have all these compounding gains from technology. But again, like if you don't step back and look at where you can gain efficiencies, you never will.
Yeah, and it's a tough thing too, because I know a lot of the people who come in with the fresh perspective are people who aren't necessarily deeply experienced. Like they've maybe been working 2, 3, 4 years, something like that. And I remember when Git started to supplant Subversion, because, everybody used Subversion for a while, right? And, Subversion, if you remember CVS, like Subversion was so much better than CVS, right? Like CVS was a horrible version control system. And, Subversion was better, but it was still not great. And then Git came along, and Git, as quirky and weird as it is, it's way better than Subversion. But I will admit that as a somewhat more experienced, I was either a dev manager or a team lead at the time, I don't remember which, but I was actually a little bit resistant to Git coming in and supplanting Subversion. But we had this developer who came in, and he was maybe 2 years out of college, and he was fantastic. I mean, I don't know what he's doing now, but like, I'm sure he's like an architect somewhere or something, because he's great. It took him kind of twisting my arm to get there. And ever since that experience, I've been a lot quicker to listen to less experienced devs who might come in with that fresh perspective. But I had to see it in action, because I've definitely seen the light with that specific decision.
I think it's awesome you use source control, particularly to highlight and emphasize that point, because for me, it was Team Foundation.
Oof.
So,
yeah.
And I mean, if you remember way back when we had the visual source destruction system, right? Microsoft's first attempt at version control. And then TFS came out, and it was good. It was better. But when Microsoft bought Git and decided to, go all in on Git, I was like, yeah, I'm getting on board with this because it's better.
Yeah.
And I completely agree. Like, if you hadn't, been exposed to that, would you still be using Subversion? Like, you'd hope not, but you never know. Like, if you've been in that habit, that routine, and you never got exposed to anything else, would you change? Like, would you have that need to change?
Yeah.
It's something that both of you have done, is kind of admitted some like large faults of yours. And it brings up a term that I've been kind of obsessed with lately called confident humility. And it's something that I really find when you can confidently talk about your faults, it opens up trust with others and really allows you to listen to new ideas, because it also helps others feel like, oh, you're human too. You're not, this amazing superhero dev that I am holding on a pedestal. And it actually allows them to feel more comfortable trying to bring something new to you. And funny enough, I'm one of those newfangled devs that only ever really touched Git. I think that I was like exposed to Subversion at some point, and I never had to work with another person on my code, so I didn't understand Subversion. And so then when I entered Git and I came in to RSI, I was the young dev who walked around and taught everyone how to use it. It was kind of cool. So I just from a perspective where, yes, I wasn't exposed. I didn't have to suffer and then find, this new tool. I did find Get very confusing though when I first started.
It's definitely quirky.
It's like and there's this weird, like, I just remember a click and all of a sudden I understood it, but it took me a while to get there. But yeah, and I'm just bringing that up because I wanted to point out that both of you were very, I'm glad you brought up your faults. I think that that's a very strong trait to be able to do.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and I think too, that was about the time when all of the front end tooling was starting to move over to being Unix, like Linux based, because all those developers were on Linux, and you were going from like building front end in. You mentioned Front Page earlier. Like there was like Front Page and Dreamweaver, and then you remember Dreamweaver? Yeah. And of course, like, I remember at WebMD when we had to have like a strict like shaming mechanism for anybody who tried to use Dreamweaver or Front Page. It's like, what are you going to do? Use Notepad? I don't even remember what we were using at the time. It was something else, but I don't know where I was going with that. I think it was just
stories.
More stories.
No, I love it. So weirdly, I had a class that taught me Dreamweaver. And then after that, if I ever brought it up, people looked at me like I was insane.
Dreamweaver was great. I spent like 3 or 4 years using Dreamweaver primarily at one point, and it was not a bad tool. It just wasn't the tool that we all needed.
That's funny.
It was better than Front Page. I will give it that.
It was light years ahead of Front Page when it came out,
That's
and
interesting.
One last thing I'd say that's kind of nice with all these advancements in tooling that we've gotten, recently, is containerization.
Yeah,
because that's the other thing when it comes to quality that we've really been focusing on lately too. Is if you don't have to worry about the infrastructure, you can write a Docker file, Docker Compose file. Like you've got yourself consistency. And it eliminates a very, very common pain point of, it works on my machine. What do you mean it doesn't work in prod? Because now you can ship your machine to prod. And that is tools like Terraform. Bicep is another one I've been kind of playing around with recently up in Azure. And it's great. Like it literally gives you that consistent, using ARM templates. It gives you a consistent way to say, here's the environment and all the specs for it, and it's going to be the same environment when it gets deployed out to production. And if you have the ability to take advantage of tools like that, we definitely should be leveraging that whenever we can.
Yeah, I do really like that. The point of using containerization for quality. Another way that we've been using it is for rollbacks, which I'm just so happy with it currently, because all I have to do is choose a different image, and then I can go worry about fixing up my Git commits and doing all the stupid long, but I can literally, oh my God, there's a problem in prod, and just go back to the old image.
Yep.
That's been my favorite thing that I feel like has really, it really helps with the SLAs too, right? So instead of the site being down for 20 minutes while I'm trying to get like a rollback to happen.
Frantically get a
rollback to happen. You just pop it back to the old version, and then you can go figure it out without the pressure. It's awesome.
Yeah, it's huge. And Azure has all these tools to work with. Like Azure has the container registry. And if you're using your tags and tagging those containers with, the build ID, what you end up with is just a list of things. You can go back and go, click, deploy. And you've got, it's up and running, and the problem goes away. And then, like you said, you can go and troubleshoot it offline where you're not costing your clients any money.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely awesome. I also would love to have a session where you just teach me Azure DevOps a little bit more. But what's really sad is it's really just the UI drives me crazy. So I spend like 20 minutes just searching within.
Well, so
the
like,
UI.
I mean, I've personally found the Azure DevOps UI is fine.
Actually, you're right.
It's
Azure
the
DevOps
Azure
is
portal
fine.
that's horrible. Like, I can't find
It's
anything in the
horrible.
Azure portal.
So two things. Azure DevOps is a gold mine of information. And if you have never taken advantage of building dashboards in Azure DevOps, let me know. I will gladly hop on a separate call with you and show you the wonder of Azure DevOps dashboards, because you can go to a page. I have a page I go to every day when I start work in the morning, and it shows me everything I need to know about what I'm working on. It shows me all my open work items. It shows me the last 5 production builds. It shows me the last 5 dev builds. It shows me the last, 50, 60 commits that we've done. It shows me everything that's relevant to actually working and being productive in the code. And my second point will be about the portal. Portal, it's absolutely terrible. It's been terrible for years. I've been using Azure since like 2008, 2009. It is absolutely horrible. And part of the reason why it's so bad, and I mean, literally, it's what I do every day for work, so I can't knock it too much. But part of the problem is everything changes.
Yeah.
They're constantly evolving new features, which is good. It does benefit us as developers somewhere down the road, but it means you have to stay abreast of that, right? Like, you're always researching things. And like, we were setting up private endpoints to, serve some of our websites in Azure the other day. And to do that once is a learning curve. To do it twice, it's a little bit better. Third, fourth, fifth, sixth time, you're almost there. And then on the 10th time, well, this one didn't work the same way as all the other ones I did. What happened? And then now you got to go digging through, pages and days of documentation to get to what the root cause of that one particular thing is. And then it's like, oh, well, I did this and this and this, and I caused this. And it's like, well, I didn't understand that happened. And so you got to kind of ravel your way back in that process. And it can be it's time consuming, and it can be confusing.
Yeah, it's the time consuming part that's really hard, at least from a managerial position where I have a lot of context switching. I'm jumping in and out of meetings. I don't have the time to sit there and like dig in and figure out why the build broke or whatever the heck, where are the secrets? That's always a hard one. So yeah, I would love to learn dashboards too, for the record. I think that sounds awesome. I think you're a gold mine of information, Zannoni.
I know a few tricks.
Yeah.
Well, we're coming up on time here, so we probably should transition into final thoughts. Do you have any?
I mean, my final thought is being a developer is a good gig. My final thoughts are that if you're passionate about something, if you're passionate about the work you do, if you're passionate about dev work, just keep at it, right? Like, just keep honing that skill, keep learning more every day. There's a vast amount of things to get into when it comes to coding. And, like we talked, you used to do Java, right? Like, C#'s been something I've done for 25 plus years. I've also done Java for about 10 in my career. So all these different tools that we have at our disposal solve different problems. And notebooks, right? Python, like, it's a tool and it has a place. And the more tools you have in your tool belt, the more problems you can solve, the more unique you can be in your approach to solving different things. So I don't know, just do what you can.
That's great. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show. We really enjoyed having you. And yeah, I don't know, Breslin, do you have anything else to add?
No, I just really appreciate your time. Always love having conversations with you. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. This has been a pleasure. Like, I love talking about code and our industry in general. And anytime you want to have me back on, please let me know. I'd be honored. Definitely.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Will do. Opinions expressed on the one-on-one belong only to us and our guests, not to any of our respective employers. You can find us on the web at the1on1.show. You can also find us in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, and YouTube by searching for The One-on-One. Please rate and review us on those services. It helps us out a lot. The One-on-One wouldn't be possible without listeners like you and a fantastic community of people who help us in ways large and small. Special thanks to Cameron Cooper, who helps us with marketing, Michael Ducharme, who created our awesome bumper music, and Elena Sayage, who has been a huge booster from day one. Thanks for listening.